This is Shannon B. Douglas, and you're watching While We Were Asleep. I'm in beautiful Kelowna, British Columbia. A lovely Saturday morning in April, preparing for the next leg of my journey across Canada. I've been here in Kelowna for 3 days, meeting with friends and with political activists who are pushing back against critical social justice and gender ideology in our schools. Some of the things I've noticed as I've traveled across the country, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about patterns that I'm seeing. And one of those patterns that I'm seeing consistently in small towns and in big cities, in Victoria, in Vancouver, in Prince George, in Terrace, in Kelowna, is the impact and the visible signs of the opioid crisis. I lived for a couple of years and had exposure to the east side of Vancouver. I wouldn't say very much north of Broadway was a regular traffic area for me, but I worked for a delivery company and I worked for a moving company whose offices were down in the East Hastings commercial district in that area. And during those years in the 90s, Vancouver was the highest rate of AIDS infection and hepatitis infection in North America. It was ground zero for the AIDS crisis, because of heroin addiction and injection needle use and sharing of needles. There was a different sort of phenomena or presentation of that crisis on the streets than we're seeing today. And most of us in the Zoom class have been sitting in front of our computers for the last couple of years, working from home in our nice, comfortable suburban houses or condos away from this crisis. But when you get down to the street level, it's apparent that something is very, very different. Now, at the beginning of the pandemic, of course we all remember this, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals released unprecedented amounts of money. They spent $576 billion since the beginning of the pandemic, was the number that I saw on the media yesterday. And we were at $400 billion in national debt. So our national debt has skyrocketed 150% since the beginning of the pandemic. Two things happened with this money and the pandemic. The first thing was, as far as the streets go, all of the safe injection sites, supervised injection sites, where addicts can get clean needles and they can test the supply that they're buying on the street to make sure that they're not going to overdose, and get access to counseling if they're able to mobilize themselves into a state where they're ready for it. Those and the shelters all shut down. I noticed in Ottawa that the people who were homeless and having struggles had expanded their territory. I guess many of them didn't believe that being housed with groups of others in shelters was a good strategy. And so spreading out on the streets and spreading out into neighborhoods in Ottawa was either a planned or a de facto kind of strategy to stay safer from COVID. So all of the social services and facilities to support people and try and help the most vulnerable people in our society shut down. And people went to the streets. And then what happened was, almost simultaneously, the government implemented CERB, that $2,000 a month stipend to people who were put out of work or who weren't working because of the pandemic. And they made it easy in the sense that if you had a bank account and a social insurance number, you could apply to get this $2,000 a month, which is a lot more government assistance than people with addictions had previously been receiving. So we shut down all the testing sites and supervised injection sites and resource sites to help people with addictions. And we shut down all the shelters, and then we give them more money than they've ever had since they've been on the street. And the results are predictable. You can see it wherever you go. Take a walk downtown of any city in Canada, and I'm willing to bet that especially in the afternoon and evenings, you're going to see the depths of human struggle. It's painful and sad. And the manifestation of the impacts on the body and on the soul of people who are addicted to these opioids, which, by the way, is a manufactured crisis, right? It was, there are a lot of similarities to big tobacco getting people hooked on cigarettes, where the big pharma companies, who are paying now billions and billions in restitution and fines for promoting these addictive drugs and knowing that they were addictive, has had very serious consequences. So physiologically speaking, I hate saying this, zombies, people whose souls have left them, and they are working from fix to fix, struggling and trying to cope. And they have sores on their faces and on their hands, and they're scratching themselves, and they are erratic in their walking patterns and the gesticulations of their arms, and you see people twitching, incoherent. The eye contact is almost nil, and there is a feeling, of paranoia and of suffering and of shame, in some cases, that are coming from some of these people. And the numbers have exploded. So as we get back to the world like it was, we may or may not notice that this is happening. But across Canada, it's a major problem. Now I'm going to turn the camera here, and behind me there's a struggling man who is down by the lakeshore, I assume looking for some cockles or some fish or something. Struggling, one of the struggling. It's we did so much for the rest of society during the pandemic. But the people who are the most vulnerable have suffered the most. The divisions between rich and poor are far more stark than they were 2 years ago. And there's such an obvious contrast standing in front of buildings where the condos are selling for 800, 900 million plus, and having such suffering on the streets below. These gaps of rich and poor, as they become more obvious, are going to put stressors on our society, and we're going to need policy and action and resources to address these post-pandemic outcomes of the kinds of financial and lockdown policies that we've enacted over the last 2 years. My name is Shannon B. Douglas. This is While We Were Asleep.